Hi guys, welcome to today's lesson with Miss Frizzell and
Miss Bradley.
Miss Bradley. Today we'll be looking at the novella Chronicle of Death, Foretold. Miss Bradley, you want to take over?
Alrighty, so a bit of background on the novel. So it was published in 1981 by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was a Colombian novelist, short story writer, screenwriter, and journalist. Marquez is considered one of the greatest Latin American authors to ever live and one of the fathers of the literary genre, magical realism. So, as we said, the genre is magical realism and can also be described as a novella, crime fiction, pundonor, journalistic reportage. Is it fact or fiction? So it is fiction, however, it is loosely based on a true crime from the 1950s. So just a summary of the plot, the novel centers on Angela, a woman whose husband rejects her soon after their wedding when he discovers she's not a virgin. So her husband, Bayardo San Roman, returns her to her house. In an effort to restore the family's honor, Angela's twin brothers, Pedro Vicario and Pablo Vicario, ask her who took her virginity, and she tells them that it was Santiago Nassar did, and the brothers find Santiago and kill him. Learning goal of this lesson is to understand the novella Chronicle of a Death Foretold as a magical realism text, which will enable the audience to acknowledge the relationship between fate and memory to be one where both can coexist but also be a direct contradiction of each other and the genre itself.
Yeah. To get too deep into the text, we will quickly look at what magic realism actually is. It was first introduced by a German art critic, Franz Roh, in 1925. The term started as a descriptive category for German art, referring to the depiction of the supernatural in a realistic setting. Merriam-Webster states it as a literary genre mainly associated with Latin America that incorporated fantastic or mythical elements into other realistic fiction. Supernatural, extraordinary images and events are depicted as everyday occurrences in this type of writing. Cool. So we will we will look at how the text conforms to the genre in reference to fate. So looking through the novel, the theme of fate, it demonstrates how it conforms to the magical realism genre. The concept of fate is embedded in the very title of the novel and introduced again in its first sentence when it says, on the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nassar got up at 5:30 in the morning to wait for the boat. The bishop was coming on. Santiago Nassar's death is foretold in two senses.
The two senses of which Santiago's death was foretold is that the first, it can only be explained if it's predestined. And the second sense is, as the narrator collects the testimonies of the townspeople, he perpetually is mystified by the incredible number of chance occurrences that, in total, created the perfect conditions for Santiago's murder.
Yes, some of these are countless examples in the text, but some of the most prominent include the anonymous note of warning that Santiago fails to notice, Bedoya's difficulty finding Santiago, and Placida Linero's locking the front door of her house in fright. Further, it becomes clear that the Vicario twins, while acting of their own free will, were also not entirely enthusiastic about killing Santiago, and in some ways tried to be stopped. More explicitly, the narrator throws around words like destiny, fate, and sentence just about as much as he does crime. On page 96, it says, the cocks of dawn would catch us trying to give order to the chain of many chance events that made absurdity possible. And it was obvious that we weren't doing it from an urge to clear up mysteries, but because none of us could go on living without an exact knowledge of the place and mission assigned to us by fate. The structure of the novel itself also supports the idea of fate, where it announces the death of the main character in its very first sentence, and doesn't allow the reader to imagine any other outcome than the one described at the start.
So we're going to go into how the text actually contradicts the genre, and we're going to be focusing on the idea of memory. So looking at the novel through the theme of memory, it demonstrates how it contradicts the magical realism genre. While this novella somewhat conforms to the magic realism genre, some could argue that the idea of fate is created by the way in which the author utilizes the memory of his characters to record the story. So structurally, this story kind of resembles a documentary film in the way that it calls upon testimonials of the village people to aid in the storytelling. Through this technique, we can discern that memory is fallible and can add a haze over the story, which perhaps makes the events of the story seem mystical. The amount of time that has passed between the event and the recording of it is especially portrayed by the indecisiveness between witnesses when it comes to the weather on the day of the murder. Some opted to describe the day to be radiant, with a sea breeze coming in through the banana groves. This kind of weather is stated by the narrator to be a norm in the fine February of that time. However, it seems most looked back on the day and believed the weather somewhat predicted the fateful events. They described the weather to be funereal, with a cloudy low sky, and at the moment of the misfortune, a thin drizzle was falling. Including the small detail that seems irrelevant to the events of the story reminds us that a lot of time has passed since the event, and details some witnesses may use to describe the day makes the setting seem a little more theatrical or mystical. Memory often makes fiction out of fact. So a good example of this is the differing accounts of the time after Santiago was killed, which were provided by Poncho Linneo and his eldest daughter. So Poncho describes the scene in a grisly way, stating that he would never forget the terrible smell of shit. And the eldest daughter says Santiago Nassar walked with his usual good bearing, measuring his steps well, and that his Saracen face, with its dashing ringlets, was handsomer than ever. So as we've seen through this text, both fate and memory can exist within a text, but they are also direct contradictions of each other. Fate is often created by memory, usually through the owner of that memory looking back at the events with a kind of hazy lens, choosing what they believe to be true and what isn't. Alrighty, so this is where we would start our class discussion. For each of the characteristics of magical realism, we have an example of it in the novel, as well as if it conforms or contradicts the genre, and we would ask the class to discuss it. So, okay. So every magical realism novel is different, but there are certain things they all include, such as a realistic setting. So all magical realism novels take place in a setting in this world that's familiar to the reader. So in the novel, this takes place in a small Colombian town in the 1950s. So this would actually conform to the genre. And magical elements, from talking objects to dead characters to telepathy, every magical realism story has fantastical elements that do not occur in our world. However, they're presented as normal. So in this novel, it actually kind of contradicts this characteristic.
With limited information, it's another characteristic. Magical realism authors deliberately leave the magic in their stories unexplained in order to normalize it as much as possible and reinforce that it is a part of everyday life. This kind of contradicts it, since mostly they give away very crucial information in the, like as we were talking about, the first couple sentences, giving away a death of a character. Another element is critique. Authors often use magical realism to offer an implicit critique of society, most notably politics and the elite. The genre grew in popularity in parts of the world like Latin America that were economically oppressed and exploited by Western countries. Magic realist writers use the genre to express their distaste and critique American imperialism. This conforms to the genre.
So I think this actually conforms to the genre in this novel, especially through the observation of the village people who claim that they have pure intentions, but they carry out impure acts, especially those two twins.
It also has a unique plot structure. Magical realism does not follow a typical narrative arc with a clear beginning, middle, and end like other literary genres. This makes for a more intense reading experience, as the reader does not know when the plot will advance or when the conflict will take place. An example of this is the author tells you what is going to happen in the first line. The novel is also a unique way of telling the story through a journalistic point of view, so it conforms. This is where we would ask the class and get them to talk amongst themselves whether the novel contradicts or conforms to the genre and why. could possibly even create a debate between two sides of the classroom. So yeah, that could be fun. Thank you, class. Hope you have a wonderful day. From Miss Frizzell and Miss Bradley, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks.
Bye.